Let's start by looking at this very influential little remark that the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein made, which really serves as the basis for Van Evera's theory of death. Wittgenstein said, "Our life has no end in just the way in which our visual field has no limit." Now that remark really needs to be interpreted, because it could be misinterpreted. For instance, what does Wittgenstein say when he says our life has no end? He does not mean that we live forever. He does not mean that our lives have no temporal limit and that we continue on infinitely. Our life has no end, and think of end as being either a temporal or spatial limit, the way that there's an end to the party when the party breaks up. There's an end to the road when the road gives out. Those things are the limits of a road or a party, either spatially or temporally. Our life has no end in just the way in which our visual field has no limit. Now, again, that helps us. If we think of our visual field, think of what is in your visual field. Think of what you can see right now if your eyes are open. Does your visual field have a limit? Well, in a way, of course, it does, because we know that our visual field is not unlimited. That is, there's only so much that we can see at any particular time, and that changes when we look around, or we move our eyes, or move our head, or different spatial orientations. But our visual field has no limit in the sense that there is no limit that is actually a part of our visual field. For instance, look at right now, look at all the things you're looking at. I see books, a poster, my own hands, a door, several doorways, a bunch of things, and they're all part of my visual field. There are things that I'm seeing right now, and maybe I'm not seeing them directly, but I'm seeing them, and I could turn my attention to them and see them more clearly and focus on them, but they're part of my visual field. There is no limit which is part of my visual field. That is, I can't see the limit to my visual field. It's not something that I could perceive. I know that my visual field is limited in the sense that there are things that I could see right now that I'm not seeing if I turned my head or moved my eyes. So I know that my visual field at any one time is not unlimited. It is limited in the sense that it's finite, and there are things that I could see which I'm not currently seeing. So it is not unlimited, yet it has no limit in the sense, and I think this is an important distinction to say, that there is no such thing called a limit which is part of my visual field. This is a very important point, I think, in sort of beginning to think through the implications of the Epicurean view of death. And again, I would urge you to look at Epicurus's letter to Menoikos, which is the beginning really of all this. Wittgenstein probably didn't read Epicurus, but is definitely following Epicurus's notions in his idea of death here. You cannot actually experience a limit in the sense of a temporal limit or a spatial limit. We know that things are limited in time, but we don't actually experience limits. We know that things are limited in space, but we don't actually see limits. We know that things are limited, but a limit is not a thing that's possible to experience directly. So that's a very important point, I think, in beginning to see his point here. Again, the idea of life having no end doesn't mean that life goes on forever. Wittgenstein means that life has no experienceable end, has no perceptible end or limit, in the same way that the visual field has no perceptible end or limit. So let's look at the very end of this. Is really working with section 1 here. The very end of that section on page 171, then he says, holding that my life has no end in this sense is perfectly consistent with the belief that I will die. in the same way that holding that my visual field has no seeable limit is perfectly consistent with the belief that my visual field is limited, right? That is, we understand that life is limited, and we understand that our visual fields are limited, yet in both cases, we don't actually experience the limit. The limit is not something that's possible to experience, and this really sets up what is perhaps Evra's major point about death, is that death functions as a limit and really is a function. And he'll give in the next sections some elaboration of an idea that how should we think of death? Well, death acts as a limiting function, an ordering function in our lives. It's not something that we actually phenomenally experience. Like right now, you and I and everyone else who's conscious is having some phenomenal experiences of colors and shapes and smells and textures. Death will never be that sort of thing for us. There will be no phenomenal reality to it. It won't be something that we live through or perceive or undergo. But rather, it is something real, but it functions, or it is real in a different way, and it operates as a function, or it has an operational, as we'll see, existence, that is. It's not something that we actually experience or ever will experience, but it's something that orders our experience. That is, we conceive of death as the limit to our lives, what we are approaching. In time, from the moment we're born, we're constantly getting closer to it, and it's a ever-present possibility, and it's a eventual inevitability. But we're constantly getting closer to it, but in the sense of, say, a mathematical limit, where we never actually, in reality, reach it, in the sense that we never reach it in terms of being able to experience it. We get closer and closer to it, in the sense that our lives get closer and closer to that limit, to their ultimate end, but we never actually experience it. So we know that life has no end in the sense of no seeable limit, no perceivable limit, but it is limited and will end. And so this notion of death as a function, as an ordering function, as having this operational reality, is really what he wants to get at, and we'll see if we can make better sense of it in the next video.